It is officially 1 week past Thanksgiving and it has dropped below 50 degrees in Missouri, so we all know what that means. It's that time of year for the holidays that started out as religious celebrations but have turned into a capitalistic cash grab that markets material objects to you so that you forget what the original holidays were all about. Regardless of how you celebrate, we can all agree that there's one very good staple for this time of year, and that is a good chocolate chip cookie. While most people would reach for the box mix or the old cookbook that's been sitting in your cabinet for years and years on end, I'm going to show you the perfect way to make a chocolate chip cookie. My name's Katie, and I will be with you as we go through this recipe. So for this recipe, you are going to need a few ingredients, the first being bread flour, next all-purpose flour. You're going to need some kosher salt, some baking soda, unsalted butter, some white sugar, dark brown sugar, vanilla, eggs, and the chocolate of your choice. The first thing that you're going to want to do is change out your sweater because you're going to be standing next to a flame. The second thing that you're going to do is you're going to brown the butter. And how we do that, it's very easy to do but very easy to screw up. You want to take a cup of butter or 2 sticks of butter and put them into a saucepan and wait for it to melt and then wait for it to boil. The entire time you're going to be wanting to use a wooden spoon to stir occasionally, but once it starts to bubble and it starts to boil, you're going to want to start stirring constantly, because what's going to happen once the butter reaches a high enough temperature, the milk fats are going to start separating from the oils and stuff that's also in the butter, and they're going to start toasting on the bottom of the pan, and that's when you want to start, stirring constantly so that way they don't burn. And that's how you brown your butter. You want to take it off the heat as quickly as possible and keep stirring so that way it doesn't just burn. You want to let it cool off for a second, and then you want to transfer it to a heat-proof container. I hope to God this doesn't shatter. I've used it before. I just... want to get all of those little good bits at the bottom too. And then what we want to do is we want to get this to room temperature, but we don't want it completely solidified. And because leaving this out at room temperature would take absolutely forever, I'm going to stick it in the freezer and check it every few minutes just to make sure that it's not, solidifying and it's also getting to the temperature that I want. Because in your cookies, you don't want to use crazy hot melted butter because that might make your cookies very greasy. And you also don't want it to be completely solidified because then it's not going to cream into your sugar as well. While we are waiting for the butter to cool, we are going to set our oven to 350 degrees and we're going to work on our other ingredients. The first thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to combine 1 cup of bread flour and 3/4 cup of all-purpose flour. And the reason I'm using these two is that I don't want to use just all-purpose or just bread flour, and the difference between the two. The difference between all-purpose and bread flour is that bread flour has more protein than all-purpose flour, and because it's typically used in bread, that's what gives bread a more chewier, denser texture, whereas all-purpose is kind of the middle ground, and cake flour has the least amount of protein in it, and that's what gives things like cakes, all those things that take cake flour a lot fluffier, lighter, less dense texture, and all-purpose is the happy medium between the two. And I want to use both all-purpose and bread flour because I want the cookie to be dense, but I don't want it to have the consistency of bread. And on top of that, you also want to add 1 teaspoon of baking soda. And a lot of people ask, should you or can you substitute baking soda for baking powder? And the answer is probably not. Because the difference between baking soda and baking powder, baking soda is sodium bicarbonate, and that in and of itself is a base. and it's a leavener. So in order for baking soda to be used in a recipe, it needs to have an acid in the recipe. So in this case, that would be the molasses and the dark brown sugar. So if you took any sort of science class in high school, middle school, you know that when bases and acids combine, there is a chemical reaction that releases carbon dioxide. That's what you do when you make the baking soda and vinegar volcano. So the same thing happens with baking soda and whatever acid is in your recipe. Baking powder contains both sodium bicarbonate, the base, and it also contains an acid. Most of the time that's either cream of tartar or it's like cornstarch or something like that, and you use that when the recipe itself doesn't have an acid in it. So that way you can still get that chemical reaction even if you don't have something like molasses. But you can use both when just the baking soda and the acid isn't enough to give it the right rise that you need, or you can use it to preserve taste. Like for example, buttermilk is a very common acid that is used in like buttermilk pancakes, but you don't want to use just baking soda with it because it would neutralize the acid in the buttermilk and would leave it without any sort of buttermilk taste. So you would use the baking powder to react to the baking soda, so that way there's still acid left in the buttermilk. It's science, so it has to be true. And you are also going to want to put in a little pinch of salt. Most of those things, once you kind of learn the right ratio, is you can kind of eyeball it, but if you want an actual measurement, you are going to need about 2 teaspoons of kosher salt. So there's that. Give it a good mix and set that aside, because now we are going to combine our wet ingredients. That being our 1 cup of dark brown sugar and our ½ cup of white sugar. I don't have dark brown sugar. I couldn't find it at the store today. So instead, I am just adding molasses to white sugar. And that's what makes brown sugar to begin with. The difference between light brown sugar and dark brown sugar is just the amount of molasses in it. So I am just adding 1 tablespoon of molasses to the sugar. And then you are going to want to add about 2 teaspoons of vanilla extract. And that's probably a little bit more than that, but that's okay. It'll taste just fine. And once the butter cools, we're going to add that and cream those all together. Once the butter is cooled off to room temperature but still isn't quite solidified, you're going to add that to the sugars, vanilla, molasses. Then we're going to cream that together until it becomes all nice and super. By the time you're done creaming the sugars and the butter together, it shouldn't be entirely liquidy, but it also shouldn't be entirely pasty. It should kind of do this where it kind of keeps its shape when you move it around with the spatula. So now what you're going to do is to this you are going to add 1 whole egg and 1 egg yolk. And eggs act as the binder to the cookie and to cakes and to most things. They basically make sure that everything sticks together and doesn't separate once it is in the oven. And you want to make sure that your eggs are room temperature, and when you crack them, don't crack them on the side of the bowl. I know a lot of people do that, but when you do that, the shell gets pushed up into the actual egg itself, and then you have to fish it out of your batter or your dough, whatever you're making, and you don't want to be that idiot that has to fish out shells. So a lot of people do the kind of like half, like back and forth kind of thing to separate the egg. I don't. I just like put it like through my fingers and then wash my hands afterwards. Like that. Big white. Put that, and wash your hands, because you do not want to be spreading salmonella everywhere. You're going to beat those in until it's all nice and homogeneous. You really want to make sure that your butter is room temperature, otherwise when you put the eggs in there, it might potentially cook your eggs, and no one wants scrambled eggs in their cookie. You're going to slowly add your dry ingredients. And we're going to chop this up into little bite-sized pieces. I use both milk chocolate and dark chocolate because it kind of adds a good balance of sweet and bitterness. But if you prefer either semi-sweet or milk chocolate chips, you can do that too. I just like this because you get a lot more chocolate with every bite. With clean hands, you're just going to take a decent amount. These are probably going to be pretty big cookies. Just roll it into a ball and stick it on there. These aren't going to spread too much, so it's okay if you kind of sit them close to the sides of the pan or sit them pretty close together. They're not going to spread too much. And you're going to put these in the oven for about 20-25 minutes. Typically, once they're like brown around the edges like this, they're done. Or if you can just like pick them up like that without them falling apart on you. Sprinkle of salt on top to kind of balance out the sweetness of the cookies. If you enjoyed this recipe, please be sure to subscribe. And if you didn't, okay. This is Katie Beilsmith signing off. Thank you for watching Rubakes.